Ancient stories are built on moments that might seem insignificant at first, until they're suddenly not. A young man steps into a winding maze, armed with more faith than certainty. A divine union, and a prophecy that would send a boy on a perilous quest for the head of a monster. The gods sit down to a feast they'll never forget, and definitely never forgive. And at a simple loom, a girl's hands move too skillfully, too boldly, as if no one were watching. These are the cracks where mortal lives brush against the divine, where pride and defiance echo louder than prayers. Some will walk away changed, others won't walk away at all. Let's get started with our first tale, Theseus and the Minotaur. In the bustling city-state of Athens, there lived a young prince who would face a monster born of divine punishment and human pride. Deep beneath the palace of Crete lay a labyrinth so vast and twisted that none who entered ever found their way out again. At its heart dwelled a beast whose hunger could only be satisfied by the sacrifice of young lives. We follow this young hero Theseus as he ventures into that maze of shadows, with no plans of becoming just another victim lost forever in the darkness. The ship's black sails caught the morning wind as it pulled away from Athens' harbour, carrying its cargo of sorrow toward the island kingdom of Crete. Aboard sailed 14 young Athenians, 7 young men and 7 maidens, chosen by lot to fulfill a terrible debt that their city owed to King Minos. Every 9th year, this tribute must be paid, these lives offered to feed the creature that walks in the depths beneath the Cretan palace, the Minotaur. Among those chosen stood Theseus, son of King Aegeus, though none aboard knew his royal blood. He had volunteered to take the place of another, stepping forward when the lots were drawn, with the quiet certainty of one who had already decided his fate. His father had wept to see him go, had begged him to reconsider, but Theseus carried within him the restless spirit that drives heroes toward their destiny regardless of cost. The journey across the calm seas of the Mediterranean took 3 days, during which the young Athenians huddled together on deck, watching their homeland shrink to a memory on the horizon. Some wept openly, others sat in stony silence, but Theseus spent the hours gazing toward their destination, his mind already turning over plans and possibilities. The other passengers looked at him strangely, puzzled by his calm demeanour when they sailed toward certain death. As Crete rose from the waves before them, its white cliffs catching the light like polished bone, its great palace spreading across the hillside in terraces of painted stone, the ship's captain began the ritual preparations for delivering his human cargo. The black sails that had carried them from Athens would remain raised until their return, a signal to those watching from shore that their mission had been completed, their burden delivered. The harbour of Knossos bustled with activity as merchants unloaded goods from distant lands and fishermen hauled in nets heavy with silver fish. Yet when the ship bearing the Athenian tribute arrived, a hush fell over the docks. Even hardened sailors and traders knew the weight of what they witnessed. Young lives being delivered to satisfy an ancient curse, beautiful youth fed to a monster's endless hunger. During the 3-day journey, across calm seas and cloudless skies, the young Athenians had nothing but time and the creeping certainty of what waited for them. Each, in their own silence, reflected on the chain of events that had led them to this fate. The tribute had been born of a betrayal. Many years before, the firstborn son of King Minos of Crete, a gifted young man by the name of Androgeos, had travelled to Athens and won every event in the Panathenaic Games. The crowds adored him, but Athens did not. Their king, Aegeus, feared what such popularity could inspire, and so the Cretan prince was sent to his death. Some say it was murder, others say it was politics. Either way, the act had stained Athens, and Minos had demanded justice. As a son of none other than Zeus himself, Minos had more than just armies at his disposal. The threat of divine punishment hung over Athens like a dark cloud in the normally azure skies, and Zeus, guardian of oaths an enforcer of divine justice, would not have turned a blind eye to the murder of his grandson. To avoid war or worse, the Athenians agreed to this darker kind of payment, a sacrifice in place of a city laid to ruin. Perhaps that was how King Aegeus made peace with it, a handful of lives to save thousands. But to those now aboard that ship, this logic offered little comfort. Of the creature that awaited them, few knew the truth. Whispers called it a monster, a blood-hungry beast with the body of a man and the head of a bull. What they didn't know, perhaps thankfully, was that the creature itself was the result of divine punishment. Years earlier, King Minos broke a vow to Poseidon. What followed was a punishment no court could sentence, and no priest could cleanse, an unspeakable union, whispered around palace halls but never openly discussed, from which something monstrous was born and hidden beneath the palace. Theseus, too, spent the voyage in quiet thought. He showed less fear than the others, but that did not mean he felt none. Perhaps his silence masked something heavier, guilt or the burden of inheritance. After all, it was his own father who had caused this very chain of events. If Aegeus had acted differently, perhaps none of them would be aboard this ship now. Theseus did not speak of who he was. Better to remain silent than to invite resentment. The others saw only another youth bound for the labyrinth. That was how he wanted it. King Minos received the tribute in his throne room, a vast chamber decorated with faded murals and polished stone, a space built more to impress than to welcome. The king himself was a man grown old in power, his eyes holding the cold certainty of one who had made peace with necessary cruelties long ago. Beside his throne stood his daughter Ariadne, whose beauty was spoken of throughout the Mediterranean. Hair like spun gold, eyes the colour of deep water, skin that seemed to glow with inner light. The 14 Athenians were presented before the throne, like offerings before an altar, their chains removed, but their fate unchanged. Minos spoke the ritual words that had been spoken the previous 2 times before, acknowledging the tribute, accepting the payment for ancient wrongs. His voice carried no malice. He took no pleasure in the gruesome fate awaiting these young Athenians. He knew his son's murder had happened before any of them were even born, but it had to be done, and so he fulfilled his duty with the cold precision expected of a king settling old debts. Yet as his gaze moved along the line of young prisoners, it lingered on Theseus, who alone among them met the king's eyes without flinching. There was something in the youth's bearing that spoke of nobility, a quiet strength that seemed strangely familiar. When Minos asked his name and lineage, Theseus answered truthfully, revealing himself as the son of Aegeus, prince of Athens and heir to its throne. A murmur rippled through the court at this revelation. That a prince should volunteer for the tribute was unprecedented, and some whispered that it showed either great courage or great foolishness. Minos studied Theseus for a long moment, perhaps remembering his own youth, his own choices that had led to this moment when he must feed royal blood to the monster beneath his feet. But it was Ariadne whose attention was truly captured. From the moment Theseus entered the throne room, she had felt something stir within her chest. It wasn't just attraction, though he was certainly handsome enough. There was something else beneath it, something she recognized but couldn't quite name. Here was a man who faced death with calm intent, carrying himself like someone who had already chosen the outcome and would walk toward it without hesitation. That evening, as the tribute victims were housed in chambers overlooking the sea, comfortable enough quarters for those about to die, Ariadne found reasons to walk past their doors. Palace servants were accustomed to their princess and her restless wanderings, her habit of seeking solitude in gardens and corridors when sleep eluded her. But tonight her steps carried her to the wing where the Athenians waited for dawn and their descent into the labyrinth. She found Theseus standing at his window, looking out over the moonlight path on water toward the distant shore of his homeland. When she spoke his name softly from the shadows, He turned without surprise, as though he had been expecting her. In the silver light that streamed through the window, they studied each other, the Cretan princess and the Athenian prince, brought together by fate and tragedy. Their conversation began carefully, each testing the other's intentions. Ariadne spoke of the labyrinth, of its construction by the master craftsman Daedalus, of passages that twisted back upon themselves, and chambers that led nowhere but deeper into confusion. She told him of the Minotaur, her half-brother, born of her mother's shameful union with a sacred bull, a creature of impossible strength and endless rage that knew every turning of its prison. Theseus listened without interruption, his attention complete and focused. When she finished, he asked the question that had been building between them. "Why are you telling me all of this?" Her answer came softly. She had watched the two previous groups of young people disappear into the labyrinth. She had heard their cries echoing up from the depths until silence claimed them. The weight of their deaths had settled upon her spirit like stone, and in Theseus she saw something different. She didn't see him as a victim. He held the look of a man who perhaps might break the wicked cycle. From beneath her cloak, she drew forth a ball of thread, the strands gleaming like captured starlight. The thread had been spun by her own hands from the finest silk. "Take this," she whispered, pressing it into his hands. "Tie one end at the entrance to the labyrinth, and let it guide you back to light when your task is done." The warmth of her fingers as they touched his carried a promise that neither dared speak aloud, that she believed he would survive, that she would be waiting when he emerged from the depths, that perhaps their meeting meant more than chance. Her fingers hesitated, then reached beneath her cloak once more. This time, she drew out a small bronze sword. It was no ceremonial blade, but a weapon nonetheless. She placed it in his hands without a word. The thread had been an act of faith. This was something else entirely, a choice she couldn't take back. Dawn came grey and cold, mist rising from the sea to shroud the palace in veils of uncertainty. The 14 Athenians were led from their chambers, down corridors of polished stone, past murals depicting ancient victories and divine favour, toward the entrance that would swallow them like the mouth of some primordial beast. The opening of the labyrinth stretched before them, a great chasm cut into the living rock. Stairs carved into its sides, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. The guards led them part way down, far enough that escape would no longer be simple, yet not so deep that the soldiers themselves risked becoming lost. Torches were placed in their hands, fire that would burn for just a few hours before leaving them lost in eternal darkness. The king's servants spoke the final ritual words, sealing their fate, then withdrew to leave them facing their destiny, alone. One by one the young Athenians began their descent, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the vast space. Some moved quickly, as though speed might somehow save them, while others walked slowly, savouring these last moments before the darkness claimed them completely. Theseus went last. In a brief moment when no watchful eyes lay upon him, he tied the thread around the outstretched horn of a weathered stone bull, carved into the rock beside the entrance, some forgotten tribute to the beast below. The thread unreeled behind him as he descended, a lifeline connecting him to the world above, and perhaps to the possibility of return. The air grew thick and strange, carrying scents of animal musk and ancient stone, of places where sunlight had never reached. As the entrance grew small above them, its light fading to a distant memory, the group found themselves in the labyrinth proper. Passages branched away in all directions, some wide enough for several people to walk abreast, others narrow as coffins. The walls were carved with symbols that meant nothing to mortal understanding, patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering torchlight. Soon, inevitably, the group began to separate. Fear drove some down one path, hope down another. Voices called out in the darkness, trying to maintain connection, but the maze seemed to swallow sound as readily as light. Within minutes, Theseus found himself alone with his torch and the thread that marked his path. The passages grew wider as Theseus walked deeper, the ceiling rising until his torchlight could no longer find it. The thread continued to unroll behind him, marking his passage through turns and choices that would have confused any mapmaker. Sometimes he heard sounds echoing from other passages, footsteps, voices, once a scream that cut off abruptly, but he pressed on toward whatever waited at the centre of the winding maze. The air began to carry a new scent, rank and wild, the smell of something that was neither fully human nor fully beast. With it came sounds that made his skin prickle. Heavy breathing, the scrape of hooves on stone, a low rumbling that might have been speech or hunger. His torch began to flicker as though the very air around him had grown thick, reluctant to feed flame. Then the passage opened into a vast circular chamber, and there, waiting on the inside, was the Minotaur. The still fearless eyes of Theseus locked onto it with the gaze of a man, with no intention of looking away. The creature stood at the room's centre, easily twice the height of a man, its body human from the waist down, but massive, corded with muscle that spoke of impossible strength. From its shoulders rose the head and neck of a bull, horns gleaming like polished bronze, eyes that held intelligence, twisted by rage and endless solitude. Around the chamber lay scattered bones, the remains of those who had come before, picked clean and forgotten. The Minotaur turned toward the light of his torch with the slow certainty of a predator that had never known defeat. When it spoke, its voice was like crushing boulders, human words twisted by a tongue that was only half man, but wholly monstrous. It welcomed Theseus with something almost resembling courtesy, a rumbling echo of language shaped by long solitude. It asked if he had come to feed it, if the world above still remembered the creature buried beneath its feet, if the sun still rose over Athens. Something in the creature stirred a reluctant pity within Theseus, a vague recognition that it had been shaped into a monster by others, fed human flesh to satisfy hungers it had never chosen. Yet the stench of death and the bones at its feet reminded him of why he had come. Without a word, he carefully set down his torch and drew the bronze sword he had concealed beneath his cloak. The battle was brief but terrible, strength against speed, desperation against hope. The Minotaur charged with the fury of years of imprisonment, its great hands reaching to crush this presumptuous mortal who dared resist his fate. But Theseus moved with the instincts of someone who had faced danger before, ducking beneath the charge, letting the beast's own momentum become its weakness. He dodged the first rush, his blade opening a line across the monster's ribs. The Minotaur's roar of pain and rage echoed through the chamber like thunder, but already Theseus was moving again, staying close where the great arms could not easily reach him. Again and again, his sword found its mark, until the creature's movements grew sluggish, its breath laboured. In the end it was almost gentle. The Minotaur sank to its knees, great head hanging low, and when it looked up at Theseus, there was something like gratitude in those terrible eyes. The beast gave no final cry. It collapsed to the floor of the chamber, its weight shaking the very foundations of the labyrinth itself. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the torchlight flickered against the blood-soaked floor of the central chamber, and Theseus was alone. Theseus knelt beside the dying creature. The great body shuddered once, then lay still, and with its passing, the very air in the chamber seemed to lighten, as though some ancient curse had finally lifted. Following the thread back through the labyrinth was like walking through a dream of the journey down. Passages that had seemed endless now passed quickly. Turns that had confused him now led surely toward the surface. The thread grew warm in his hands as he wound it up, Ariadne's gift guiding him toward light and life and the promise of freedom. He called out from the depths of his lungs to his fellow Athenians, shouting that the beast was slain, that any who could hear him should follow his voice through the twisted hallways, now growing darker by the moment, their torches nothing more than dying embers. Ariadne waited at the mouth of the labyrinth as the sun had reached its zenith for the day. When Theseus emerged into the light, she ran to him without any thought for royal protocol, and he caught her in arms, still trembling from his ordeal. Behind him came the other Athenians, fewer than had descended, but some had found their way to safety once the Minotaur's death freed them from the maze's malevolent influence. Their escape from Crete happened quickly, aided by Ariadne's knowledge of the palace and her people's shock at the impossible. Someone had emerged alive from the labyrinth. The tribute had ended. The ancient cycle was broken. By the time King Minos learned what had occurred, their ship was already hull down on the horizon, black sails filled with wind that carried them toward Athens and home. But victory carried its own shadows. The trip home was 3 days with the winds in their favour, so they made a stop on the island of Naxos. Here they could gather food and replenish their dwindling water supply from a freshwater spring they had heard rumours about. They were also in much need of some good rest after their sleepless night and traumatising ordeal. But Theseus grew restless that night, unable to fall into a calming embrace of the night, troubled by dreams and doubts. There, in the moonlight, Theseus had a vision. The god Dionysus appeared before him. Unmistakable, radiant, terrible. He claimed Ariadne to be his destined bride, speaking with the calm of inevitability rather than threat. And in that moment, Theseus felt the crushing weight of fates larger than mortal understanding, yielding to divine purpose. When they set sail from Naxos before dawn, Ariadne did not go with them. Theseus was heartbroken, but knew he was powerless against a mighty god, and he dare not challenge the divine will radiating from Olympus. He gathered the other Athenians and they left in a hurry, trying to reach the open sea before Ariadne awoke from her slumber. The journey home to Athens brought further tragedy, born of his own forgetfulness. In his grief and confusion, Theseus had forgotten to make one crucial change before their voyage set course for home. Before leaving Athens, Theseus had made a promise to his father. If he slew the beast and escaped the labyrinth, he would change the ship's sails to white, to celebrate his victory and the ending of this brutal tribute. Black sails were the traditional mark of sorrow for Athenian ships returning from such perilous ventures, signifying the beginning of a period of mourning for the whole city. Theseus forgot to change the black sails for white ones, the signal that would tell his father of his safe return. King Aegeus, watching from the cliffs and seeing those dark sails on the horizon, threw himself into the sea rather than live with the knowledge of his son's death, or the guilt he felt for having been the one responsible. So Theseus returned home victorious yet broken, a hero who had saved his people but lost those he loved most. With his father gone, he was now the reluctant king. He would rule Athens wisely and well, but he carried always the knowledge that courage alone cannot protect us from the sorrows that wait in every choice we make, even in moments of glory. And so, the hero's journey is rarely a simple triumph. It teaches us that victory often demands unforeseen prices, and that even the noblest intentions can pave the path to heartbreaking regret. This echoes through the ages, a solemn reminder of how intertwined our greatest achievements are with our deepest human frailties. In the ancient city of Argos, King Acrisius built a tower of bronze to hold his daughter Danae. The oracle had spoken troubling words. His daughter would bear a son, and that son would one day cause his death. So the king sealed her away from the world, believing bronze walls could thwart the threads of fate. The tower rose smooth and windowless, with only a small opening at the top to let in light. Danae lived there in lonely splendour, watching clouds drift past her narrow view of sky. Yet the gods move in ways that mortal walls cannot contain. Zeus, lord of storms and sky, looked down upon the imprisoned princess and felt his heart stir with divine love. When the golden rain began to fall, it came from Zeus himself, transformed into droplets of liquid light. Through that single opening in the bronze chamber, the divine essence descended, and in that moment of celestial touch, Perseus was conceived. The child came into the world with eyes like deep ocean water, and a cry that seemed to echo with future greatness. When Acrisius discovered his grandson's birth, terror stirred within his heart. He dared not kill a child of Zeus directly, so instead he sealed his daughter and the infant child in a wooden chest and cast them upon the open sea, leaving their fate to the mercy of wind and wave. For days beyond counting, the chest rode the swells, guided by invisible hands toward distant shores. When it finally came to rest on the beach of Seriphus, caught in the nets of a kind fisherman named Dictys, it was as though the sea itself had delivered a gift to the world. Seriphus was an island of quiet beauty, its shores fringed with white sand, and its hills covered in wild olive trees. Here Perseus grew, from child to young man, under the gentle care of Dictys and his mother's fierce love. The boy moved through his childhood with a grace that spoke of divine heritage, running along beaches where his feet barely seemed to touch the sand, swimming in hidden coves with the fluid precision of one born to greater things. Danae watched her son with eyes that held both pride and worry, for she understood the weight of prophecy that surrounded him and clouded his future. In quiet evenings when the sea turned to gold beneath the setting sun, she would tell him stories of heroes and gods, weaving around him tales that would serve as armour in trials yet to come. But peace has a way of dissolving when touched by darker intentions. King Polydectes of Seriphus had long desired Danae, whose beauty had only deepened with the years. Perseus stood between the king and his desires, a young man now tall and strong, whose very presence served as both protection for his mother and reproach to royal ambition. At a great feast in his palace, Polydectes announced his intention to marry another woman and called upon each guest to offer appropriate gifts. When Perseus rose to speak, his young voice carried clear across the torchlit hall. He had no wealth to offer, he admitted honestly, but he would bring whatever gift the king might name, no matter how difficult it might prove to obtain. The silence that followed stretched like the moment between lightning and thunder. When Polydectes spoke at last, his voice carried false warmth as he named his price. The head of Medusa, he boldly requested, the Gorgon whose gaze could turn living flesh to stone. Perseus felt the trap closing around his words and honour alike, yet something deeper than fear stirred within him. Without hesitation, he accepted the challenge that was meant to be his doom. The gods who watch mortal struggles with ancient eyes took notice of the young man bound to such a perilous quest and sought to offer him help. Athena came first, appearing as wisdom, taking gentle form, offering guidance and a shield polished to a mirror shine. Through this shield, she explained, he could look upon Medusa's reflection without meeting the deadly gaze directly. Hermes followed, his winged sandals shimmering with barely contained motion. When worn, they would carry Perseus through the air itself, making vast distances into brief journeys. The messenger god also brought a cap borrowed from Hades that would render its wearer invisible, and an adamantine sickle sharp enough to cut through divine flesh. Even armed with divine gifts, Perseus faced the challenge of finding Medusa's dwelling, which lay beyond the edges of the known world. To locate this realm of shadows, he would need to seek the Grey Eye, the Grey Sisters, who shared between them a single eye and a single tooth, and who knew secrets older than the stars. The journey carried him across waters that grew stranger as he travelled, their colours shifting from familiar blue to shades that had no names. Islands rose from these mysterious seas, like half-remembered dreams, their shores wreathed in mists that whispered with ancient voices. Here time flowed differently, sometimes swift as mountain streams, sometimes slow as honey in winter. When he found the Grey Sisters in their cave beside the world's edge, they crouched around a cold fire like ancient birds. their shared eye glowing with accumulated wisdom. Perseus waited in shadow until the moment when the eye changed hands, then stepped forward to claim it, holding their sight hostage until they revealed the path to Medusa's lair. Their directions led him beyond familiar constellations, into regions where the air seemed thick with malevolence, and reality itself felt uncertain. The cap of Hades rendered him invisible, while Hermes' sandals bore him swift and silent through landscapes that would have driven ordinary mortals to madness. The Gorgons' realm lay wrapped in perpetual twilight, surrounded by a garden of statues that had once been men. Warriors and wanderers who had sought the Gorgons for various purposes now stood frozen in stone, their faces locked in expressions of terror and awe, serving as stark reminder of what awaited those who looked upon Medusa directly. Among the three sisters who dwelt in this place of eternal dusk, only Medusa bore the curse of the killing gaze. All three slept now in their shadowed hall, serpent hair writhing even in dreams, their breathing creating whispers in the stagnant air. Perseus approached with soundless steps, guided by Athena's shield that showed him what his eyes dared not see. The face revealed in that polished surface might once have been beautiful beyond imagining, but curse had transformed it into something that transcended both beauty and horror. The serpents moved with an almost hypnotic grace, their scales catching the dim light. The adamantine sickle moved with divine purpose, guided by blessed hands. In one swift motion that seemed to occur outside normal time, the blade severed Medusa's head, and the ancient curse found its release. Yet even in death the Gorgon's power remained undiminished, her severed head retaining the terrible gift that could turn flesh to stone. Perseus caught the head, without looking upon it, wrapping it carefully, while the cap of Hades kept him hidden from the awakening sisters, whose immortal fury began to shake their realm. The winged sandals bore him away from that place of ancient curse, carrying him back toward the world of mortal concerns. The journey home carried Perseus over lands where new adventures waited, flying through air that tasted of freedom. After the oppressive atmosphere of the Gorgon's realm, he came upon a sight that stirred his divine-touched heart. A maiden chained to rocks beside the sea, her beauty shining against the harsh stone that held her prisoner. Andromeda was put there through no fault of her own, but because her mother's boast had stirred the wrath of sea gods who measured insults carefully. The great beast that rose from the depths to claim her moved through the waves like a living mountain, its approach marked by waters that churned white with fury. Perseus felt destiny moving around him, like currents in a vast ocean. The head of Medusa held power enough to turn even sea monsters to stone, and he understood that divine gifts were meant to serve purposes larger than personal glory. The battle moved between sea and sky, Perseus dancing through air on winged sandals, while the monster thrashed below. When at last he unveiled Medusa's face to the creature's gaze, transformation came swift as lightning, turning living fury into stone that sank beneath waves, which gradually returned to their normal rhythm. Andromeda's gratitude transformed into something deeper as they journeyed towards Seriphus together. She listened with wonder to his tales of divine encounters and impossible quests, while he found in her wisdom that complemented his courage and love, that promised to anchor him when fate's winds grew strong. But Seriphus showed signs that peace had not reigned in his absence. His mother and faithful Dictys had fled to the temples for sanctuary, driven there by the king's increasingly aggressive pursuit of what he considered his due. The final confrontation came in the great hall where Perseus had first accepted his deadly challenge. King Polydectes sat upon his throne with the confidence of one who believed his rival safely dead, surrounded by nobles who had grown comfortable with corruption. When Perseus announced his return and the completion of his quest, Polydectes and his followers responded with mockery, refusing to believe any mortal could have succeeded where heroes had found only death. Their laughter echoed from stone walls until Perseus reached into his bundle and prepared to reveal what lay within. The unveiling of Medusa's head brought silence swifter than any royal command, followed by the sound of flesh becoming stone. Polydectes and his corrupt court found themselves transformed into lifeless statues, their expressions frozen in surprise. Their schemes ended as suddenly as their lives. Perseus wrapped the terrible head once more, knowing its power must be contained. He gifted the head to Athena, placing it upon her shield, where it would become a symbol of protection. She would later fashion a breastplate of bronze that bore the image of the serpent-haired Gorgon, which would protect her in her many battles. The athletic games at Larissa drew Perseus as they drew many young nobles, offering chances to test strength in competitions that echoed life's greater contests. When it was his turn to throw, the discus that left his hand seemed to fly straight, but the wind shifted its path in ways no mortal could anticipate. As the discus veered toward the crowd, Perseus held his breath. It struck an old man in the head, and as he fell to the ground, his frame bent with age and the weight of long-carried fears. When Perseus learned the old man's name, he felt the cold touch of recognition. Acrisius had wandered far from Argos, trying to escape the prophecy that had haunted him since Perseus's birth, yet fate had drawn him to this place, at this moment. The irony was complete. The man who had tried to prevent his death by casting daughter and grandson upon the waves had created the very circumstances that brought about the oracle's fulfillment. Perseus wept for the grandfather who had feared him without knowing him, understanding at last the full weight of destiny that had shaped his life. In years that followed, Perseus would rule wisely, building cities and raising children who carried forward the mingled blood of gods and mortals. Andromeda bore him sons and daughters whose stories would weave into the great tapestry of legend, and their love proved that even lives touched by divine purpose could find happiness in simple gifts of companionship. But on quiet evenings when the sun set over waters that held memories of all his voyages, Perseus would sometimes remember the weight of divine gifts, the price of heroic deeds, and the strange mercy that can be found even in prophecies that seem to promise only sorrow. The stars wheeled overhead, as they always had, carrying with them the light of courage, tested in darkness, and wisdom learned through trials that transform both hero and world. In the age when the boundary between mortal and divine was as permeable as morning mist, when gods walked among humans and shared their tables, their wine, their laughter, there lived a king whose name would echo through eternity, not for his conquests or his wisdom, but for a single moment of terrible choice. Tantalus ruled over the fertile lands of Lydia, where olive groves stretched silver-green beneath azure skies, and vineyards climbed hillsides like cascading emeralds. His kingdom prospered under his rule, blessed with harvests so abundant that neighboring lands spoke of his realm as touched by divine favor. The king himself was a figure of striking presence, tall and noble-featured, with eyes that held the depth of one who had gazed upon both earthly beauty and celestial wonder. For Tantalus possessed a gift that set him apart from other mortals. He was welcomed at the table of the gods themselves. Mount Olympus knew his footsteps upon its ethereal paths, and the great hall where Zeus held court had echoed with his laughter. He had tasted nectar that flowed like liquid starlight, had eaten ambrosia that dissolved upon the tongue like sweetened clouds, had listened to music that seemed to emerge from the very foundations of existence itself. Yet within this blessing lay the seed of something darker, for familiarity, even with the divine, can breed a dangerous assumption of equality. The transition between his earthly throne and his seat at the divine table had perhaps become too seamless, the distinction between mortal king and immortal god too blurred in his mind. The palace of Tantalus rose from the hillside like a crown of white marble and gold, its gardens terraced in splendor, where fountains sang their eternal songs and flowers bloomed in colors that seemed to capture the light of sunrise. Within these walls, Tantalus lived a life that straddled two worlds. By day, He attended to his kingdom with diligence, holding court beneath silk canopies, settling disputes with wisdom that seemed to flow from some deeper source than mere human understanding. By night, when the moon cast silver pathways across the landscape, he would often find himself walking roads that existed only for those blessed with divine invitation. At the divine table, he found himself among beings whose very presence seemed to illuminate the air around them. Zeus would lean forward to hear his stories of mortal affairs, while Hera nodded approvingly at his descriptions of justice served in his kingdom. Apollo requested tales of the music and poetry that flourished under his patronage, and these gatherings were filled with the kind of easy camaraderie that made him feel truly understood. The wine of the gods flowed freely, and with it, the boundaries of propriety that governed mortal interactions began to blur. Here, surrounded by immortals, Tantalus felt the return of his earlier self, witty, confident, unguarded in his speech and manner. Yet as time passed, something began to gnaw at his mind. Were the gods truly his friends, or was he merely their entertainment? The question lay dormant during his visits to Olympus, but in the quiet hours of his mortal reign, it grew stronger. The invitation came on a day when spring was surrendering to summer. A messenger bearing the insignia of Olympus delivered Zeus's request. The king of the gods wished to honor Tantalus by accepting his hospitality, to experience the famous generosity of the Lydian court. Tantalus received this news with joy, seeing the culmination of his greatest ambitions, to host the gods in his own hall, to demonstrate that mortal hospitality could match divine splendor. This was honor beyond measure. He threw himself into preparations with fervor, determined to create a feast that would be remembered through all ages. The greatest chefs of his kingdom labored for days, while hunters ranged far to bring back the finest game. Tables were set with service of gold and silver, gardens replanted to bloom in perfect harmony, musicians rehearsing compositions that seemed to channel the very music of the spheres. Yet as the day approached, the doubts that had been festering in secret places of his heart grew stronger. When he watched the gods' faces carefully at previous gatherings, had he seen signs of condescension lurking beneath their courtesy? When they praised his wine, had he heard faint mockery? The more he observed in memory, the more convinced he became that their friendship was nothing more than elaborate deception. As the evening progressed, and the gods reclined upon couches of silk and gold, their divine forms casting gentle radiance throughout the hall, Tantalus felt for the first time the vast gulf that separated his mortality from their immortal nature. A terrible idea began to form in the depths of his troubled thoughts. If the gods were merely humoring him, if they saw him as nothing more than an entertaining pet, then perhaps it was time to test the true nature of their divine knowledge. The idea, once conceived, grew with the inexorable power of obsession. Tantalus excused himself from the feast, claiming the need to oversee the preparation of a special final course. His footsteps echoed through corridors that had grown strangely quiet, as if the very stones of his palace sensed the enormity of what he contemplated. In the private chambers where his family slept in innocent trust, Tantalus found his young son Pelops. The boy lay peaceful in slumber, his face carrying the unmarked beauty of childhood, his breathing gentle as a whisper. Here was perfection in mortal form, life untouched by the complexities and corruptions that had poisoned his father's heart. The act that followed was performed in a state that existed beyond normal consciousness, as if Tantalus had stepped outside himself and become a witness to his own actions. His hands moved with mechanical precision, while his mind retreated to a place where thought and feeling could not penetrate. When he returned to the feast, he carried with him dishes that would test the very foundations of divine knowledge and mortal understanding. The final course was his son Pelops himself, carved and stewed like any other delicacy, offered as a test to see if the gods would recognize what lay upon their plates. The gods received the final course with the same gracious appreciation they had shown throughout the evening. Steam rose from the covered platters, carrying aromas that should have been appetizing, but somehow seemed to disturb the very air through which they passed. Yet, as the covers were lifted, a change came over the assembled immortals. The easy conversation faltered, then ceased entirely. One by one the gods set down their cups and turned their attention fully to what had been placed before them, their divine senses immediately recognizing what their host had done. Zeus was the first to speak, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. Tantalus, the king of the gods, said, and in that single word lay the weight of judgment absolute. We see what you have done. Did you truly believe that divine sight could be deceived by mortal cunning? The punishment, when it came, was delivered with the inexorable certainty of natural law. Zeus spoke again, his words shaping reality as they emerged, creating the conditions that would define Tantalus's existence for all eternity. There would be no dramatic proclamation, only the quiet restructuring of existence to accommodate the consequences of choice. Tantalus found himself transported to a realm shaped by divine justice. Here stood a lake of the clearest water, its surface reflecting endless depths below. The water was cool and pure, more refreshing than any earthly spring, yet it possessed a quality that made it simultaneously the most desirable and most unattainable substance in existence. Above the lake hung branches heavy with fruit of every variety, apples that glowed with internal light, pears that captured the essence of summer, grapes that pulsed with concentrated sweetness. Here Tantalus would spend eternity, his punishment precisely calibrated to his crime. He who had destroyed the most precious thing in his life would be forever tantalized by the prospect of sustaining life through food and drink. The water would recede whenever he bent to drink, disappearing into the lake bed as if it had never existed. The fruit would lift itself beyond his grasp whenever he reached upward, the branches bending away from his touch as if moved by invisible winds. As the ages passed, Tantalus began to comprehend the true nature of what he had lost. The hunger and thirst that consumed him were not merely physical sensations, but spiritual metaphors for the deeper hungers of the soul, the need for connection, for meaning, for the kind of satisfaction that comes only from giving rather than taking. Tantalus had everything a mortal could ever wish for: kingdoms, divine favor, even a seat at the table of the gods. And yet, he threw it all away because he couldn't silence the intrusive thought that he wasn't truly their equal. The gods had shown him no disrespect. The doubt came from within. From insecurities he couldn't name, he had power, privilege, divine company, and it still wasn't enough, because no external gift can quiet internal shame. So at the very moment he should have felt most honored, most accepted, he committed something unthinkable. His story is extreme, but also deeply human. Insecurity, the fear of not belonging, the urge to test those around us just to feel sure of their love. These are universal. We push boundaries, sabotage trust, burn bridges, not because others failed us, but because we failed to believe we were ever worthy in the first place. Pelops, the boy who had been served at the feast, was not forgotten. The gods who had been served his flesh on a platter, in a rare act of mercy, restored him, piece by piece, and gave him back to the world. But Tantalus was never restored, nor should he be, for his act is among the most evil a person can even conjure in their mind, let alone follow through with. Some lines, once crossed, offer no return. His name, a word for the kind of torment that tempts but never delivers, to hunger for something just beyond reach. That's all he left behind. In the ancient hills of Lydia, where purple-dyed wool made kingdoms wealthy, and the sound of looms created a music that echoed through every household from dawn until dusk, there lived a maiden whose fingers seemed to have been touched by divine inspiration. Arachne was born to humble circumstances, in a village where the art of weaving had been passed down through countless generations like a sacred trust, where mothers taught daughters the ancient patterns that told stories older than memory itself. Her father, Idmon, was a dyer whose hands were forever stained with the colours of his trade. Deep crimsons extracted from shells gathered at the edge of the world, royal purples that commanded prices worthy of kings, golden yellows that seemed to capture sunlight itself within their threads. Their cottage sat at the village's heart, surrounded by gardens where plants grew, not for their beauty, but for the dyes that could be coaxed from their roots and leaves. From her earliest childhood, Arachne displayed a gift that transcended the merely mortal realm of craft and skill. While other children played with dolls carved from wood or balls sewn from scraps of cloth, she sat beside her loom with the patience of one far beyond her years, her small fingers moving with a precision that made seasoned weavers pause in their own work to watch in amazement. The threads seemed to respond to her touch as if they possessed their own intelligence, flowing into patterns that appeared to breathe with life. As she grew from child to maiden, Arachne's reputation spread like ripples across still water, carried by merchants and nobles who spoke in hushed tones of tapestries that seemed to contain captured fragments of dreams. Her creations were not mere decorations, but windows into worlds that existed beyond the reach of ordinary sight. Woven narratives that told stories of love and loss, of beauty so profound it could bring tears to the eyes of the most hardened observers. The loom upon which Arachne worked her wonders had been her grandmother's before her, a frame of olive wood worn smooth by generations of hands, its posts carved with symbols that spoke of protection and inspiration. When Arachne sat before her loom, something magical occurred that went beyond the simple intersection of warp and weft. Her fingers moved with a rhythm that seemed to echo the very heartbeat of creation itself, drawing threads through their appointed places, with movements so fluid they appeared more like dance than labor. The tapestries that emerged from her loom defied every convention of her craft. Where other weavers created flat representations, Arachne's work possessed depth that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the fabric itself. Her flowers appeared to sway in breezes that existed only within their woven world, while her birds poised to take flight from their textile sky. The faces she created held expressions so lifelike that observers found themselves searching for the thoughts behind those thread-formed eyes. Word of her extraordinary gift reached every corner of the known world, carried by caravans that crossed deserts and ships that sailed wine-dark seas. Nobles travelled from distant kingdoms to commission work from her hands, offering treasures that would have made her father wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Yet Arachne accepted only what she needed to continue her work, for she understood that her gift was not something to be hoarded, but rather shared, like water from a spring that grows fuller the more freely it flows. Success, like wine drunk too quickly, can intoxicate even the wisest soul, and Arachne began to feel within her heart the stirring of a pride that grew with each compliment paid to her skill. The praise that had once brought her simple joy began to feed something deeper and more dangerous, a belief that her gift was hers alone, earned through her own efforts, rather than bestowed by forces beyond mortal understanding. Where once she had spoken of her work with humility, acknowledging the mystery of inspiration that flowed through her fingers, she began to speak instead of technique and training, of study and dedication. The gratitude she had always offered to the gods who blessed her craft gradually gave way to a conviction that her achievements were the product of her own exceptional nature. Her father, Idmon, watched this transformation with growing unease. He had seen how the gods dealt with mortals who claimed too much credit for gifts that were divine in origin, had heard the stories passed down through generations of weavers who understood that their craft was sacred. Yet when he tried to counsel Arachne, she would only smile and speak of the hours she had spent in practice, the years she had devoted to perfecting her art. The breaking point came on a day when autumn had painted the hillsides in shades of gold and crimson. A group of women from the village had gathered around Arachne's loom to watch her work, their voices soft with admiration, as they observed the creation of a tapestry that depicted the wedding of earth and sky, where golden threads seemed to pulse with actual sunlight. "Surely," said one of the women, her voice filled with reverent wonder, "the goddess Athena herself could create nothing more beautiful than this. Your skill rivals that of the immortals themselves." Instead of offering the proper response, Arachne paused in her weaving and looked up with eyes that held a dangerous gleam. "Rivals," she said, her voice carrying a note that made the cottage seem suddenly smaller. "I think my work surpasses anything the goddess might create. Let her come and compete with me if she dares, and we shall see whose art proves superior." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame, carrying within them a weight that seemed to make the very foundations of the cottage tremble. The women who had gathered to admire Arachne's work drew back with sharp intakes of breath, understanding that they had witnessed something that could not be unsaid, words that would echo through realms both mortal and divine. For 3 days, nothing happened. The sun rose and set as it always had, and Arachne began to believe that her words had been absorbed by the ordinary fabric of daily life without consequence. She continued her weaving with renewed confidence, her fingers flying through patterns that grew more complex and beautiful with each passing hour. But on the 4th morning, as mist rose from the valleys and the first light touched the peaks of distant mountains, a figure appeared on the path that led to Arachne's cottage. She walked with the measured pace of one who had all eternity at her disposal, appearing to be an elderly woman, bent with age and leaning heavily upon a staff carved from wood so ancient it remembered the first trees. Her hair was white as newly fallen snow, braided with silver threads that caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. Her robes were simple homespun wool, yet they seemed to shift colour with each movement. But it was her eyes that revealed her true nature, eyes that held depths no mortal gaze could fathom, ancient as the stars yet bright with intelligence that had witnessed the birth of civilizations. She stopped before Arachne's cottage and raised her staff 3 times, each tap producing a sound that resonated through dimensions invisible to mortal perception. "Child," she called, her voice carrying the authority of mountains and the gentleness of spring rain, "I have come to speak with one who claims mastery over the sacred art of weaving." Arachne emerged from her cottage with the confidence of youth that believes itself invincible, yet something in the old woman's presence made her step slow as she approached. There was about the stranger an aura that spoke of power, held in careful restraint, of wisdom earned through experiences that spanned eons. "Grandmother," Arachne said, offering the respectful greeting due to age, though her tone carried an edge of impatience, "what brings you to my humble cottage?" The old woman's eyes seemed to grow brighter, as if lit from within by fires that burned with something other than ordinary flame. "I seek not to commission work, but to offer counsel," she said, her words carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the stones of the cottage walls. "Word has reached even my distant dwelling of a young weaver whose skill is said to rival that of the immortals themselves. Such claims trouble me, for I have lived long enough to know that pride is a thread that once pulled can unravel the most beautiful tapestry." Yet Arachne felt within her chest a flame of defiance that seemed to burn brighter with each word. "I speak only truth," she replied, her chin lifting with stubborn pride. "My work speaks for itself. Let any challenger come forward, mortal or divine, and I will prove that skill matters more than divine favour." "Child," the old woman said, her voice now carrying undertones that made the morning air itself seem to hold its breath. "There is wisdom in knowing the proper place of mortal gifts within the great tapestry of existence. Your talent is indeed extraordinary, but it is a gift that flows from sources beyond your own nature. Acknowledge this truth, and your art will bring you joy throughout a long and prosperous life." But Arachne had passed beyond the reach of wisdom. Intoxicated by years of praise and convinced of her own supremacy, "I acknowledge no debt to any goddess," she declared, her words carrying across the village like thunder before a storm. "My skill is mine alone. If Athena believes herself my superior, let her prove it at the loom." The transformation that followed was like watching sunlight break through storm clouds, revealing truths that had been hidden by veils of mortal perception. The old woman's bent form straightened, her staff becoming a spear that gleamed with its own inner light, her simple robes transforming into armour that seemed forged from starlight itself. The years fell away from her face like discarded masks, revealing features of such perfect beauty and terrible majesty that the very air around her began to shimmer with barely contained power. This was Athena herself, goddess of wisdom and patron of all craftsmen, she who had taught mortals the arts of civilization and watched over their development with divine patience. Her owl materialized upon her shoulder, with eyes that seemed to hold reflections of all knowledge that had ever been or ever would be. "Mortal maiden," Athena said, her voice now carrying the full weight of divine authority, "you have been offered wisdom and chosen folly, shown the path of humility and selected the road of pride. Very well. Let us settle this matter at the loom, and may the truth of your skill be revealed for all to see." 2 looms appeared as if woven from the morning air itself, their frames carved from wood that pulsed with its own inner life, their strings gleaming like captured starlight. The contest that began was like nothing the world had ever witnessed. Both weavers sat before their looms with the poised grace of masters, their hands moving with rhythms that spoke of deep understanding, of connection to forces that flowed beneath the surface of ordinary perception. Athena's tapestry grew beneath her fingers, like a garden blooming in fast motion, each thread placed with the precision of one who understood not merely the techniques of weaving, but the fundamental principles that governed the relationship between mortal and divine. Her work depicted the majesty of the gods in all their glory, yet carried within it a message of harmony, showing gods and mortals working together in the grand design of existence. Arachne's tapestry, growing beneath her flying fingers with skill that truly did rival the divine, told a different story altogether. Her work depicted the gods in their moments of weakness and shame, showing Zeus in his countless disguises, Poseidon's destructive rages, Apollo's vanity that turned love into tragedy. Each scene was rendered with technical perfection, yet the overall effect was one of bitter criticism, of mortal defiance, hurled in the face of divine authority. The irony was not lost on those who possessed the wisdom to perceive it. In creating a work that criticized the gods for their flaws, Arachne had demonstrated the very pride and presumption that her tapestry condemned in others. Her technical skill was indeed extraordinary, perhaps even equal to that of the goddess herself, yet it was skill employed in service of destructive rather than creative purposes. When both weavers finally set down their shuttles, a silence fell that seemed to encompass the entire world. The two tapestries hung before their creators, like windows into different understandings of existence, each technically perfect, yet carrying entirely different visions of what it meant to be mortal in a world governed by immortal powers. Athena regarded Arachne's work with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, that had watched countless mortals struggle with the same pride that now blazed from every thread of the girl's tapestry. There was indeed skill here that rivaled her own, yet the goddess could see what Arachne herself could not, that technical mastery without wisdom was like a weapon without guidance. "Your skill is indeed remarkable," Athena said, her voice carrying both acknowledgement and sadness. "Yet skill alone does not make art. You have woven with your fingers, but not with your heart, created beauty that serves only your own pride, rather than the greater tapestry of existence." Arachne felt the truth of these words, like physical blows, yet her pride was too deeply rooted to allow for admission of error. "My work speaks truth," she declared, though her voice carried less conviction than before. The goddess's expression grew stern, though beneath the divine authority, there remained traces of the teacher who had hoped to guide a gifted student away from destruction. "Then receive the gift you have chosen for yourself," Athena said, raising her hand with fingers that seemed to channel forces older than the mountains. "Since you love weaving above all else, let weaving be your eternal occupation, but learn humility through your craft, and perhaps in time you will understand what your pride has cost you." The transformation began at Arachne's fingertips, a tingling that spread with inexorable patience. Her fingers, so skilled at manipulating thread and shuttle, began to elongate and multiply, growing into delicate appendages perfectly designed for the creation of silken strands. Her body contracted and darkened, becoming compact and efficient, a form that embodied the very essence of the weaving craft she had claimed as her own exclusive domain. Yet even as her physical form changed, something of Arachne's essential self remained. Her skill, her artistry, her ability to create beauty from simple materials. The spider she became possessed gifts that no ordinary arachnid could claim, spinning webs of such intricate beauty that they seemed like tiny windows into paradise. In the corner of the cottage where Arachne's loom had once stood, a small spider began to weave, her web growing with the same patient precision that had once characterized her human craft. The threads she spun were finer than any silk that had ever graced a royal loom, creating patterns that breathed with life to capture and hold light in ways that defied natural law. Athena watched this transformation with mixed emotions, satisfaction that justice had been served, yet sadness for the potential that had been lost to pride. The goddess understood that Arachne's punishment was also a kind of mercy, allowing her to continue practicing the art she loved while learning, through endless repetition, the humility that had eluded her in human form. As seasons turned and years passed, the story of Arachne spread throughout the world, becoming a tale told by mothers to their children, by masters to their apprentices, by anyone who worked with their hands and understood the delicate balance between pride in one's craft and proper acknowledgement of the sources from which all gifts flow. In gardens and corners, in doorways and forgotten spaces, spiders continued to weave their intricate patterns, each web a reminder that beauty can emerge from the humblest circumstances, that art exists not for the glorification of the artist, but for the enrichment of the world itself. And sometimes, when morning dew transformed a simple web into a masterpiece of liquid light, Observers might pause and remember the maiden whose pride had led to transformation, whose punishment had become its own form of immortal art. The gentle sound of silk being spun in darkness carries within it the memory of human hands that once moved with divine grace, the echo of a talent that transcended mortality, even as it was bound by mortal limitations. In the rhythm of that eternal weaving lies both warning and wonder, a reminder that the greatest gifts require the greatest humility, and that true artistry serves not the self, but the endless, beautiful tapestry of existence itself. We hope you've enjoyed this journey through ancient tales. Be sure to stick around for more videos, as we'll have a lot more Greek mythology videos coming out very soon. Thanks for watching.